Hello and welcome to Brogna Arts. Today we are comparing the Strathmore 400 series watercolor paper and the Arches cold press watercolor paper. Both of these papers are cold press and 300 GSM, or 140 pounds. The difference between the two is that the Strathmore paper is a cellulose paper and the Arches is a 100% cotton paper. Things to note right off the bat is that the Strathmore is a brighter white than the Arches, and the Strathmore is smoother to the touch. Cellulose is usually a wood pulp paper, whereas the cotton is made from cotton fibers. The texture on the back of the Strathmore is more pronounced. There is still some texture on the back of the Arches, but I find it much harder to tell which side is supposed to be the front. I have honestly used both sides of the Arches on smaller pieces, and you can't see the texture of the back side on the Arches. The surface of the Arches is a rougher texture that feels somewhat like a fine sandpaper. The texture tends to grab whatever touches it. You can also notice the rough paper texture through pencil marks. I honestly try to avoid drawing on the Arches paper and making a lot of pencil marks because they are very hard to erase and you usually cannot erase them completely. I don't have the same problem with the Strathmore, and the pencil goes on smoothly and pencil marks erase very easily. To test these papers, I am doing a few different tests. I am testing with Emerald Green from my White Nights palette. I started by doing a single stroke on each of the pages to get a control of the color on the page. Then, using the wet on wet technique, I tested for color diffusion. I took a clean brush and painted a square of water and then dropped in some color to see how the color would diffuse in the water. Next, I test to see how the paper would handle a flat wash. After that, I am testing a two-color blend by painting another flat wash and then laying another color onto that wash. And finally, I am doing another brush stroke and then testing how the pigment lifts off of the page for both when it is wet and dry. Here are the finished tests. I will get into my findings more as we demo on each paper. Now for the painting demonstration, I am doing a basic landscape painting of a misty forest. I am starting on the Strathmore paper. I am mostly using the color Emerald Green again, and then adding some indigo on the edges towards the end of the painting. After testing the papers, I found that on the Strathmore, water tended to pool and warp the paper more. The absorption time was very strange because in the center of washes, it was very quick, and then where the paper was warping and pooling, it took much longer for the paper to dry. I was also getting a lot of backwashes on the paper. In the wet on wet diffusion, the colors seem to appear more intense and pigmented than on the Arches, but the pigments spread more vertically than they did horizontally, which revealed more of the paper grain. During the two-color blend on the Strathmore, the brush strokes of the second colors seem to lift some of the green wash underneath it. And for the lift test on the Strathmore, it lifted very easily after the paint dried. I personally like to paint with many layers, so I do not like it when the paint lifts too easily. I've run into this problem a lot while painting on this paper. On the Strathmore paper, the dry time was giving me some issues, minor details you probably cannot see on camera, but I was having some trouble with the tree trunks drying before I could add on branches, so you can see more of my brush strokes when I wanted them to blend into the already wet paper seamlessly. Also, the edges were not too precise when using the wet on dry technique. When blending out the bottom of the trees into the mist to create lost edges, I found that the water would lift up the pigment a bit too easily and then create pretty hard edges of gradients rather than smooth, gradual transitions. Now we are painting on the arches paper. After testing the arches, I found that the pigment doesn't seem as dark, but it does appear more even and consistent throughout the brushstroke. That is clearly noticeable in the flat wash. There was no pooling, no warping with the wash. The water was absorbed into the paper and did not sit on top of the surface. But the dry time for the arches was longer. The wet paper stayed wet for longer and more workable than the Strathmore. I didn't have the same issue of backwashes on the arches because there was no major pooling. In the color diffusion, the spread seemed to be very even and circular, and there was no noticeable paper texture. I didn't have the color lift at all during the two-color blend, and as you can see, we have some really nice gradation between the two pigments. And finally, it was much harder to lift the color on the arches when the paint was both wet and dry. I was able to get off more when it was dry, but it still stained the paper and not as much lifted when compared to the Strathmore. On the arches, I was able to get more precise lines and edges because the water was not sitting on top of the paper surface but being absorbed into it. The dry time was a lot longer, so I did not have the same problem of trees drying before I was done with them, and gradations did appear more subtle and not as much pigment lifted when I was blending the lower edges. I personally use both of these papers a lot, but I use them for different purposes. I use the Strathmore for lots of color tests, testing out mixes, color palettes, and smaller watercolor studies. It is a more affordable paper and it's good to have a paper that is not always breaking the bank. I have used it for larger works and commissions, but I did not like the way it was layering because I was getting too much lifting in shadow areas when building up a lot of layers. I would get splotches of lighter areas in the shadow areas, and covering those up was an absolute pain. I do like the arches, but it is expensive. If you are debating on what part of your painting process to invest in, I suggest investing in your paper. It makes a big difference in water control, layering, and working while wet. Also, because watercolor is a transparent medium and you work light to dark, the paper is usually your brightest white and still remains visible at the end of your painting. Here are the final paintings. I did my best to keep them similar, but the difference in the paper does show within the brush strokes and the washes. If this video was informative to you and helped you learn about different watercolor papers, please give the video a like and subscribe to Brogna Arts for more art videos.